Oh, do come in. It seems we have another little puzzle on our hands, don't we?
The Robin Who Sang at Midnight, a Miss Marple mystery, narrated by Connor from Velvet Clues. Welcome, dear listeners, to another evening with Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your host for tonight's mysterious tale. Pour yourself something warm, settle into your favourite chair, and let me transport you to the village of St. Mary Mead, where even the songs of birds can hide deadly secrets. Tonight we follow Miss Jane Marple as she unravels a puzzle that begins with an unusual midnight serenade and ends with a truth more twisted than any melody. Chapter 1. A Song Out of Season. The church clock of St. Mary Mead had just finished chiming midnight when Miss Jane Marple was awakened by the most extraordinary sound. Through her bedroom window, clear and sweet in the still October air, came the unmistakable song of a robin. She lay perfectly still in her bed, her sharp mind immediately alert despite the late hour, listening to the liquid notes that seemed to cascade from somewhere near the village green. Miss Marple had lived in St. Mary Mead for more years than she cared to count, and in all that time she had never heard a robin sing at such an hour. These cheerful creatures were dawn singers, heralding the arrival of morning with their melodious calls. To hear one in the depths of night was as unusual as finding snowdrops blooming in August. Rising quietly from her bed, she wrapped her dressing gown around her slight frame and moved to the window. The village lay bathed in moonlight, its familiar cottages and winding lanes transformed into something mysterious and ethereal. The robin's song continued, hauntingly beautiful, yet somehow wrong in its timing. As she stood at the window, straining her eyes in the darkness, Miss Marple caught sight of a shadowy figure moving near the old oak tree on the village green. The figure paused, seemed to listen to the birdsong, then hurried away toward the lane that led to Gossington Hall. The song stopped abruptly, leaving only the whisper of wind through the autumn leaves. Miss Marple remained at her window for several more minutes, but both the mysterious figure and the nocturnal robin had vanished into the night. She returned to her bed with a troubled mind, knowing from long experience that unusual events in small villages rarely occurred without significance. The next morning brought unseasonably warm sunshine and the news that shattered St. Mary Mead's peaceful routine. Mrs. Dolly Bantry arrived at Miss Marple's cottage shortly after breakfast, her face flushed with excitement and distress in equal measure. "Jane, my dear, the most dreadful thing has happened," she announced, settling herself heavily into Miss Marple's sitting-room chair. "Poor Mr. Weatherby has been found dead in his cottage. Dr. Haydock says it appears to be poison." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful precision. "Mr. Alfred Weatherby? How very shocking. When was he discovered?" "This morning, when Mrs. Price went to deliver his weekly groceries. She found him slumped over his kitchen table, poor soul. There was a half-empty teacup beside him, and the strangest smell in the air. Dr. Haydock arrived within minutes and said he'd never seen anything quite like it." Alfred Weatherby had been a quiet, solitary man in his 70s, a retired bank clerk who had moved to St. Mary Mead some 5 years ago. He kept to himself mostly, tending his small garden and taking long walks through the countryside. Miss Marple recalled seeing him often at the church fete, always purchasing items from the various stalls but rarely engaging in conversation. "How very sad," Miss Marple murmured, though her mind was already working. "I don't suppose anyone saw anything unusual last night, or heard anything out of the ordinary?" Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "Not that I've heard, though now that you mention it, Colonel Melchett did say something odd. He was up late reading in his study when he thought he heard a bird singing around midnight. Said it reminded him of something, but he couldn't quite place what." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. A bird singing at midnight. How very curious. What sort of bird did the Colonel think it might have been? "He said it sounded like a robin, but that couldn't be right, could it? Robins don't sing at night." Mrs. Bantry paused, studying Miss Marple's thoughtful expression. "You look as though you've heard something similar." "Indeed I did. I was awakened by the most beautiful robin song just as the clock struck midnight. I even saw someone moving about near the village green, though I couldn't make out who it was." The two women sat in contemplative silence for a moment, the implications of this coincidence settling between them like a tangible presence. In Miss Marple's long experience, such timing was rarely accidental. "I think," Miss Marple said quietly, "that I should like to pay my respects to poor Mr. Weatherby. Perhaps Inspector Slack would permit me to accompany him when he examines the cottage. Sometimes fresh eyes can notice details that might otherwise be overlooked." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "Do you think there's more to this than meets the eye, Jane?" Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the peaceful village scene. Somewhere out there was a person who had used the cover of darkness and the distraction of a midnight song to commit murder. The robin's melody that had seemed so hauntingly beautiful in the night now took on a more sinister significance. "I think," she replied softly, "that we have heard our first clue. And, like all the best clues, it was hiding in plain sight, dressed as something perfectly innocent." Chapter 2. Echoes of a Forgotten War. Inspector Slack arrived in St. Mary Mead with his characteristic blend of professional efficiency and barely concealed irritation at having to investigate what appeared to be a straightforward case of poisoning in a sleepy village. Miss Marple, having positioned herself strategically near the post office, where all village news inevitably converged, observed his arrival with interest. "Another suspicious death in your village, Miss Marple," he remarked as he encountered her on his way to Weatherby's cottage. "Beginning to think this place attracts trouble." "Or, perhaps," Miss Marple replied mildly, "trouble simply reveals itself more easily in a small community where everyone knows everyone else's business. Might I accompany you to poor Mr. Weatherby's cottage? I knew him slightly from church, and I may be able to provide some background information." Inspector Slack, who had learned from previous encounters to value Miss Marple's observations despite his initial scepticism, nodded grudgingly. Together they walked down the lane to Ivy Cottage, where Alfred Weatherby had lived his quiet, solitary life. The cottage was small and neat, surrounded by a meticulously maintained garden that showed signs of loving care. Inside, the rooms were spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean. The kitchen, where Weatherby had been found, still bore the eerie stillness that death leaves in its wake. Dr. Haydock looked up from his examination as they entered. "Preliminary examination suggests nicotine poisoning," he reported. "Concentrated form, probably derived from tobacco plants. Would have acted quite quickly once ingested." Miss Marple's sharp eyes surveyed the scene while Inspector Slack questioned Dr. Haydock about the details. The kitchen table held the remnants of what had been Weatherby's final meal, a simple supper of bread, cheese, and tea. The teacup that had apparently contained the poison sat innocuously beside his plate, its floral pattern somehow making the crime seem more domestic, and therefore more disturbing. It was while examining the sitting room that Miss Marple made her first significant discovery. On the mantelpiece, partially hidden behind a small clock, stood a framed photograph that made her catch her breath. It showed a group of young men in military uniform, clearly from the wartime years. At the centre of the group stood a younger Alfred Weatherby, and beside him was a face she recognised immediately. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe you should see this." Inspector Slack joined her at the mantelpiece, studying the photograph with professional interest. "Wartime picture, by the look of it." "Indeed, but notice the man standing beside him. That's Colonel Melchett, though he was considerably younger then." Miss Marple paused, her mind working rapidly. "And, if I'm not mistaken, that uniform suggests they were both in signals intelligence." Dr. Haydock approached, wiping his hands on his handkerchief. "Signals intelligence, that's interesting. During the war, those units often worked with, what did they call them? Resistance networks, I believe." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Which would explain something that's been puzzling me. Mrs. Bantry mentioned that Colonel Melchett heard the robins singing last night and said it reminded him of something. If both men had wartime experience with coded communications—" She trailed off, her attention caught by something else on the mantel. Behind the photograph, almost concealed by its frame, was a small brass whistle, tarnished with age. She lifted it carefully, noting its weight and the intricate pattern engraved on its surface. "This is rather specialized," she observed, showing it to the others. "Not an ordinary whistle, but something designed for precise sound modulation, the sort of thing that might be used for bird calls." Inspector Slack's expression sharpened. "Bird calls? You mean like the robin song you heard last night?" "Exactly like that. During the war, resistance operatives often used bird calls as coded signals. Each species, each pattern of notes could convey specific messages. It would be a perfect way to communicate without arousing suspicion. Dr. Haydock examined the whistle with new interest. "You're suggesting that Weatherby was involved in some sort of wartime espionage?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that Mr. Weatherby possessed skills and knowledge that might have made him dangerous to someone, even all these years later. Wars end, Inspector, but secrets can live for decades." As they continued their examination of the cottage, Miss Marple found further evidence to support her growing theory. In Weatherby's bedroom, tucked away in an old tobacco tin, were several newspaper clippings from recent years. All dealt with former wartime agents and resistance fighters being tracked down and prosecuted for various crimes committed during the conflict. Someone was keeping track of current events in that particular area, she noted, showing the clippings to Inspector Slack, almost as though he was concerned about his own safety. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple noticed something glinting in the garden beneath the kitchen window. Half buried in the soft earth was a small brass button, military in design and bearing the insignia of a signals regiment. "This wasn't lost recently," she observed, brushing the dirt from its surface. "The tarnishing suggests it's been here for some time, but it's also been disturbed recently. Someone was here last night, Inspector, and they were searching for something specific." Inspector Slack pocketed the button, his expression grim. "So, we're dealing with a murder that has its roots in wartime activities. That widens our suspect pool considerably." Miss Marple stood in Weatherby's garden, looking back at the cottage where a lonely old man had met his end. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead was someone who had killed to protect a secret that dated back to the darkest days of the war. The robin's midnight song had not been a natural phenomenon, but a deadly signal that had lured Alfred Weatherby to his final appointment. "The past has a way of catching up with us all," she murmured. "The question now is, who else in our village carries secrets from those difficult years?" Chapter 3. The Broken Cage and Silent Witnesses. The morning sun cast long shadows through Miss Marple's sitting-room windows as she sat with her knitting, contemplating the events of the previous evening. Her conversation with Inspector Slack had revealed disturbing possibilities about Alfred Weatherby's death, but she felt certain that important clues remained hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right perspective to illuminate their significance. Her meditation was interrupted by a soft knock at her door. She opened it to find young Timothy Morrison, the village postman's son, standing on her doorstep with an expression of barely contained excitement. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple, but Mum said I should tell you about what I found this morning on my paper round." Miss Marple invited the boy into her sitting room and offered him a biscuit from her tin. Timothy was perhaps 14, with the sharp eyes and insatiable curiosity that made him an excellent source of village intelligence. "Now then, Timothy, what is it you discovered?" The boy's face lit up with the importance of his news. "Well, miss, you know how I always cut through the churchyard on my way to Gossington Hall? This morning I found the strangest thing behind the old yew tree near the back wall. A birdcage, miss, all smashed up, like someone had thrown it against the stone." Miss Marple set down her knitting with careful precision. "A birdcage, you say? Was there any sign of what type of bird it might have housed?" "That's the queer thing, miss. There were a few feathers scattered about, and they looked like robin feathers to me, bright orange-red on the breast, just like the robins in our garden." Timothy paused, his brow furrowing. "But why would anyone keep a robin in a cage? They're not cage birds, are they?" "Indeed they are not," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully. "Wild robins are fiercely territorial and don't adapt well to captivity. Someone keeping a robin in a cage would need a very specific reason for doing so." She paused. "Timothy, did you notice anything else unusual about the area? Any other objects or disturbances?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Yes, miss, there were footprints in the soft earth near the wall, quite fresh by the look of them, and I found this caught on a bramble bush." He reached into his pocket and produced a small scrap of dark fabric. "Wool, by the texture." Miss Marple examined the fabric with interest. It was of good quality, dark navy or black, and showed signs of having been torn rather than cut. "You've been very observant, Timothy." Did you happen to see anyone near the churchyard last evening or early this morning? Well, I did see Mr. Pembroke walking his dog rather late last night when I was coming home from choir practice. He seemed to be heading toward the churchyard, which struck me as odd, since he usually takes his evening walk in the opposite direction. Gerald Pembroke was a relative newcomer to St. Mary Mead, having arrived about 2 years ago. He claimed to be a retired civil servant, though Miss Marple had always found his background somewhat vague when questioned at village social functions. He lived alone in a neat cottage near the edge of the village and kept very much to himself. After Timothy departed, Miss Marple decided that a visit to the churchyard was in order. She walked slowly through the village, her keen eyes noting the subtle signs of tension that Alfred Weatherby's death had introduced to their normally peaceful community. Curtains twitched as she passed, and conversations seemed to pause when she came within earshot. The churchyard of St. Mary Mead was ancient and peaceful, its weathered headstones standing like silent witnesses to generations of village life and death. Miss Marple made her way carefully to the area behind the old yew tree, where she found the scene exactly as Timothy had described. The birdcage had been thoroughly destroyed, its wire frame twisted and broken as though someone had attacked it in a fury. Scattered among the debris were indeed robin feathers, their distinctive colouring unmistakable in the morning light. But it was what Miss Marple found beneath the largest piece of the cage that proved most illuminating. Hidden in the grass was a small silver object that glinted in the sunlight. She picked it up carefully, recognizing it immediately as a bird whistle, similar to, but distinct from, the one they had found in Weatherby's cottage. This one bore no military markings, but was instead inscribed with tiny musical notes along its surface. Miss Marple examined the whistle closely, noting the precision of its construction and the professional quality of the engraving. This was not a child's toy or a simple sporting whistle, but a specialized instrument designed for creating specific sounds. Someone had used this whistle to train the robin, teaching it to sing on command rather than following its natural instincts. As she continued her examination of the area, she discovered additional evidence of the previous night's activities. The footprints Timothy had mentioned were indeed fresh and appeared to have been made by someone wearing heavy walking boots. The prints led from the broken cage toward the back wall of the churchyard, then disappeared onto the stone path that connected to the main village road. More intriguingly, she found signs that someone had been conducting a systematic search of the area. Leaves disturbed, small branches broken, and the earth around several graves showing signs of recent disturbance. Whatever the searcher had been looking for, they had been thorough in their efforts. Miss Marple stood among the ancient graves, holding the silver whistle and contemplating its significance. The destruction of the birdcage and the evidence of a frantic search suggested that someone had been desperate to eliminate all traces of their activities. The robin that had sung at midnight had been no natural phenomenon, but a trained bird responding to specific signals. But if the bird had been destroyed along with its cage, what had become of the trainer? More importantly, what secret had been so dangerous that someone would commit murder to protect it, then return the following night to destroy all evidence of their method? As she walked home through the village, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of the case. In her long experience, the most dangerous secrets were often those that appeared to be buried safely in the past, only to rise again when least expected. Alfred Weatherby had died because he knew something that threatened someone in their present community, and that someone had used skills learned long ago to silence him forever. The robin's midnight song had been both a signal and a weapon, luring its intended victim to a fatal appointment while providing the murderer with the perfect cover for their movements. Now, with the bird presumably dead and its cage destroyed, the killer must have felt secure that their method could never be discovered. But they had reckoned without the careful observations of a 14-year-old boy and the persistent curiosity of an elderly lady who understood that even the most innocent-seeming events could hide deadly secrets. Chapter 4. Photographs and Forgotten Faces. The following afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage in the person of Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright, the village librarian. Mrs. Cartwright was a precise, scholarly woman in her 60s who had served as the guardian of St. Mary Mead's modest collection of books and local historical documents for over 20 years. She rarely made social calls, preferring the quiet company of her books to village gossip, which made her appearance at Miss Marple's door all the more significant. "I do hope I'm not disturbing you, Miss Marple, but I felt I should speak with someone about what I discovered this morning." Mrs. Cartwright's voice carried an uncharacteristic tremor of uncertainty. "Given the terrible business with poor Mr. Weatherby, I thought you might be the right person to consult." Miss Marple welcomed her unexpected guest with tea and her customary gentle attention. Mrs. Cartwright settled herself nervously on the edge of the sitting-room chair, clutching a manila envelope to her chest like a shield. "I arrived at the library early this morning to find that someone had broken in during the night," Mrs. Cartwright began, her usual composure visibly shaken. "Nothing seemed to be missing from the main collection, but my office had been thoroughly searched. Papers were scattered, drawers pulled out, and my filing cabinets had been gone through with what I can only describe as desperate efficiency." Miss Marple's interest sharpened considerably. "How distressing for you. Did the intruder take anything specific?" "That's just it. They seemed to be looking for something very particular, and I believe they found it." Mrs. Cartwright's fingers tightened on the envelope. "I keep a small archive of local historical materials, including photographs and documents dating back to the Great War. This morning I discovered that someone had removed several photographs from my collection of wartime materials." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "What sort of photographs were taken?" "Group photographs of local men who served in various military units. I maintain these records as part of our village's historical documentation." Mrs. Cartwright paused, gathering her courage. "But here's what's strange. I'd made copies of some of the photographs just last month for a small exhibition we were planning about the village's wartime contribution. The burglar didn't know about these copies, and I found something rather disturbing when I compared what was taken with what remains." She opened the manila envelope with trembling fingers and withdrew 3 black and white photographs, each showing groups of men in military uniform. Miss Marple examined them carefully, noting the quality of the printing and the careful way they had been mounted and labelled. "The stolen photographs all showed members of the same unit," Mrs. Cartwright explained, "a signals intelligence group that operated in occupied Europe during 1943 and 1944. But when I looked more closely at the copies I had retained, I realized that I recognized more faces than I had previously thought." Miss Marple studied the photographs with growing fascination. The central image showed 12 men posed in front of what appeared to be a French farmhouse, their expressions serious beneath military caps. She recognized Alfred Weatherby immediately, his younger face unmistakable despite the passage of time. Colonel Melchett stood beside him, as she had seen in the photograph at Weatherby's cottage, but it was the third face that made Miss Marple's breath catch in her throat. "Mrs. Cartwright," she said quietly, "this man here on the left side of the group, do you know who he is?" Mrs. Cartwright leaned forward, adjusting her spectacles to peer at the photograph. "I believe that's Pembroke, Gerald Pembroke. Though he would have been Gerald Pembridge then, he resumed using his family name when he moved to the village 2 years ago." The implications of this settled over Miss Marple like a cold shadow. Gerald Pembroke had not mentioned his wartime service with Weatherby and Colonel Melchett, despite living in the same small village for 2 years. His presence in all 3 stolen photographs suggested that someone had been very keen to eliminate evidence of his wartime activities. "Mrs. Cartwright, what do you know about the specific activities of this signals unit?" The librarian hesitated, glancing around the sitting room as though afraid of being overheard. "I did some research when I first acquired these photographs. The unit was involved in what they called special operations, working with French resistance groups to establish communication networks behind enemy lines. Dangerous work, and not always strictly according to military regulations." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. During the war, the lines between heroism and criminality had often become blurred, especially in occupied territory, where survival sometimes demanded morally ambiguous choices. Men who had been heroes during the conflict might later be viewed as war criminals if their actions were examined by peacetime standards. "There's something else," Mrs. Cartwright continued, reaching into her envelope again. "I found this tucked behind one of the photograph frames." She produced a small piece of paper, yellowed with age, and covered in what appeared to be a coded message written in pencil. Miss Marple examined the paper carefully. The writing was faded but still legible, consisting of groups of letters and numbers that meant nothing to her untrained eye. But at the bottom of the page, In slightly different handwriting were the words, "Robin's nest compromised. Extraction impossible. Burn everything." Robin's nest, Miss Marple murmured. A code name, perhaps. That would be my assumption. Many resistance operations used bird-related code names during the war. It provided a natural cover for radio communications and written messages. Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind working rapidly through the implications of these discoveries. The Midnight Robin's song took on new significance when viewed in the context of wartime espionage and coded communications. Someone had used Alfred Weatherby's own skills against him, luring him to his death with a signal that would have been immediately recognizable to a former intelligence operative. But the destruction of the photograph suggested something more than simple murder to hide wartime activities. Someone was systematically eliminating evidence of their past, which implied they feared discovery for specific reasons. The question was whether they were hiding war crimes, treachery, or something else entirely. "Mrs. Cartwright, did your research reveal anything about what happened to this unit after the war?" The librarian's expression grew troubled. Most of the members returned to civilian life without incident, but there were irregularities. Some of the men were investigated for various activities during their service. Nothing was ever proven conclusively, but careers were ruined and reputations destroyed. She paused. "I believe that's why Mr. Pembroke, or Pembridge as he was then, changed his name and moved away from his previous life." Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the peaceful village scene while her mind grappled with the complex web of past and present emerging from the investigation. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead was a person who had killed once to protect their secrets, and would undoubtedly kill again if they felt threatened. The broken birdcage, the stolen photographs, the coded message, all pointed toward a single conclusion. Alfred Weatherby had died because he knew something about wartime activities that could destroy someone's carefully constructed new life, and that someone was growing increasingly desperate to cover their tracks. Chapter 5. The Colonel's Confession. The autumn evening was drawing in with unseasonable warmth when Miss Marple received an unexpected telephone call from Colonel Melchett. His voice, usually robust and confident, carried an undertone of distress that immediately caught her attention. "Miss Marple, I wonder if I might impose upon your time this evening. There are matters concerning poor Weatherby's death that I feel I must discuss with someone of discretion. Would 9 o'clock be convenient?" Miss Marple assured him that it would be, and promptly at 9 o'clock Colonel Melchett arrived at her cottage. He appeared older than his years, his usually erect military bearing somewhat stooped, and his face bore the drawn expression of a man wrestling with difficult decisions. She settled him in her sitting room with a whisky and soda, noting how his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the glass. Whatever had brought the Colonel to her door, it was clearly a matter of considerable emotional weight. "I've been thinking about that Robin song we both heard the other night," he began without preamble. "It's been haunting me, Miss Marple, not just the sound itself, but what it meant. You see, I recognised it immediately, though I couldn't admit as much to that Inspector Slackfellow." Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gave him her full attention. "Recognised it? How, Colonel?" "It was one of our signals during the war. Operation Robin, we called ourselves, a rather romantic name for what was actually quite brutal work." He took a substantial sip of his whisky. "Alfred, myself, and 10 other men were dropped behind enemy lines in 1943 to work with the French resistance. That particular Robin's song was our emergency signal, used to indicate immediate danger or a compromised position." The Colonel's revelation confirmed Miss Marple's growing suspicions about the wartime connections in Alfred Weatherby's death. "You recognised the signal immediately, then?" "Indeed I did. It was as familiar to me as my own heartbeat. We used it dozens of times during our 18 months in occupied France." His expression darkened. "But hearing it the other night filled me with dread rather than nostalgia. Someone was using our old signals, and that could only mean that someone from our unit was in danger." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Did you know that Mr. Gerald Pembroke was also a member of your unit?" Colonel Melchett's face went ashen. "Pembroke, here, in the village? But his name was Pembridge during the war, and I thought he had emigrated to Australia years ago." He set down his glass with enough force to rattle the side table. "Good God, Miss Marple, if Gerald is here, then we may all be in considerable danger." Danger from whom, Colonel? From Gerald himself, I'm afraid. The Colonel's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. You see, there was an incident during our time in France, a terrible business that we all swore never to speak of, but which has haunted every survivor of Operation Robin for the past 30 years. Miss Marple waited patiently while Colonel Melchett gathered his courage to continue. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and creating an atmosphere that seemed to encourage the confession of old secrets. We were operating near a small village called Saint-Marcel in the autumn of 1943. Our mission was to establish communication links with local resistance groups and coordinate supply drops from England. Gerald was our explosives expert, brilliant with anything involving demolitions or sabotage. The Colonel paused, staring into his whiskey as though it might provide answers to questions that had tormented him for decades. There was a suspicion that we had been betrayed by someone in the local resistance cell. People were disappearing, safe houses were being raided, and German patrols seemed to know our movements before we made them. Miss Marple could see where this story was heading, but she allowed the Colonel to tell it in his own way, understanding that confession was often as much about the confessor's need for absolution as it was about revelation of truth. Gerald became convinced that a local priest, Father Bernard, was passing information to the Germans. The man had access to the entire resistance network through his pastoral duties, and Gerald argued that no one else could have known enough to betray us so systematically. And what action did your unit take? Colonel Melchett's hands clenched into fists. Gerald took matters into his own hands. He planted explosives in the church during what he knew would be a crowded evening service. The official story was that it was a German reprisal for resistance activities, but we knew the truth. 17 people died in that explosion, including Father Bernard. The enormity of this revelation settled over the sitting room like a physical presence. Miss Marple found herself struggling to reconcile the quiet man she had occasionally encountered in the village with someone capable of such calculated mass murder. Was Father Bernard actually guilty of collaboration? We never knew for certain. After the explosion, the betrayal stopped. But that could have been because the Germans lost their source of information, or because they changed their methods. Gerald was convinced he had eliminated a traitor, but the rest of us... The Colonel's voice trailed off. Miss Marple began to understand the true complexity of Alfred Weatherby's murder. Mr. Weatherby knew about this incident. We all did. It was impossible to keep such a thing secret from the men who had to live with Gerald afterward. Alfred was particularly disturbed by what had happened. He was a moral man, deeply religious, and the thought that we had participated in the killing of innocent civilians, including a priest, tormented him. And now, 30 years later, someone was threatening to expose this secret? Colonel Melchett nodded grimly. There have been several investigations in recent years into war crimes committed by Allied forces during the occupation. The political climate has changed, and actions that were overlooked immediately after the war are now being examined more critically. If anyone came forward with evidence about the Saint-Marcel incident... Miss Marple could see the full picture now. Mr. Weatherby was considering speaking to the authorities about what happened in France. I believe so. He had been asking questions, contacting other members of the unit, trying to determine who else knew the full truth. Alfred was never comfortable with keeping such secrets, and as he grew older, I think the weight of them became unbearable. The Robin's midnight song had not been a random signal, but a specific message intended for Alfred Weatherby. Someone had lured him from his cottage using a wartime code that would have been immediately recognizable and impossible to ignore for a former intelligence operative. Colonel, do you believe that Mr. Pembroke is responsible for Alfred's death? I don't want to believe it, but the evidence seems compelling. Gerald always was ruthless when he felt threatened, and the stakes now are enormous. If the truth about Saint-Marcel became public, it wouldn't just destroy his reputation, it could result in criminal charges and imprisonment. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, contemplating the quiet village street while processing the Colonel's revelations. The case had evolved from a simple poisoning into something far more complex and dangerous. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead was a man who had committed mass murder during wartime and was now willing to kill again to protect his secret. But there were still questions that remained unanswered, pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit the narrative Colonel Melchett had provided. Miss Marple had learned long ago that the most dangerous assumptions were often those that seemed most logical. "Colonel," she said finally, "I think we must both be very careful. If your assessment is correct, then we are dealing with someone who has already killed twice, once during the war and once just days ago. He will not hesitate to kill again if he believes his secret is threatened." Chapter 6. The Whistle in the Woods. The morning after Colonel Melchett's revelations dawned grey and misty, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to muffle sound and create an atmosphere of secretive unease throughout St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple woke with the uncomfortable feeling that events were moving toward a climax, and that she possessed only fragments of a story far more complex than anyone yet realized. She was taking her breakfast when Mrs. Price, the postmistress, arrived at her door in a state of considerable agitation. Mrs. Price was normally a composed woman who prided herself on her discretion regarding the private affairs of the villagers, making her obvious distress all the more significant. "Miss Marple, I hope you don't mind my calling so early, but something rather alarming has happened, and I felt you should know immediately." Miss Marple invited her in and settled her with tea, noting the way Mrs. Price's hands shook as she lifted her cup to her lips. "It's about Mr. Pembroke," Mrs. Price began without preamble. "My Tom was out early this morning, checking his rabbit snares in Hangman's Wood, when he heard the most peculiar sounds coming from the old quarry area. Whistling, he said, but not like any bird he'd ever heard. Musical, but wrong somehow." Miss Marple's interest sharpened immediately. What time was this? Just before dawn, around 5:30. Tom said the whistling went on for about 10 minutes, then stopped abruptly. He was curious, so he crept closer through the trees to see what was making the sound. Mrs. Price paused, gathering her courage. He saw Mr. Pembroke standing in the clearing by the old quarry, holding what looked like a small flute or whistle, but that wasn't the strangest part. What else did Tom observe? There was a robin, Miss Marple, a live robin, sitting on a branch not 10 feet away from Mr. Pembroke, and every time he played his whistle, the bird would answer with its own song. It was like they were having a conversation. Miss Marple set down her teacup, her mind racing. Did Tom see anything else? Mrs. Price nodded grimly. When the session ended, Mr. Pembroke reached into a cloth bag he'd brought with him and pulled out what Tom thought was food for the bird. But instead of scattering it on the ground, he put it into a small dish and placed it near the robin's perch. The bird flew down immediately and began eating. The implications were deeply disturbing. If Gerald Pembroke was training a robin to respond to specific whistle commands, it suggested a level of premeditation that went far beyond a crime of passion. The midnight song that had lured Alfred Weatherby to his death had been part of an elaborate and carefully orchestrated plan. "Mrs. Price, where is Tom now? I should very much like to speak with him about what he observed." "He's at home, miss, but he's quite shaken by the whole business. He said there was something unnatural about the way the bird responded to Mr. Pembroke's signals, like it had been trained for a specific purpose." Miss Marple rose and reached for her coat. "I think Tom and I should take a walk to Hangman's Wood together. Fresh evidence has a way of disappearing if it's not examined promptly." An hour later, Miss Marple found herself following young Tom Price through the winding paths of Hangman's Wood toward the abandoned quarry where his disturbing observations had taken place. Tom was a reliable boy of 16, who worked part-time for his mother at the post office and supplemented his income with rabbiting and odd jobs around the village. "It was just here, Miss Marple," he said, pointing to a small clearing where the old quarry workings had left a natural amphitheatre in the landscape. Mr. Pembroke was standing right there by that fallen log, and the robin was perched on that ash tree. Miss Marple examined the area carefully, her trained eyes searching for any evidence that might have been left behind. The ground was soft from the previous night's drizzle, and she could indeed make out the impressions of a man's boots near the fallen log. More significantly, she found traces of what appeared to be birdseed scattered near the base of the ash tree. "Tom, you mentioned that Mr. Pembroke fed the bird from a dish. Did you see what became of that dish?" The young man pointed toward a pile of dead leaves near the quarry edge. "I think he hid it over there before he left, covered it up with branches and such." A careful search revealed a small metal bowl, military in design and bearing the faded markings of army surplus equipment. Traces of bird seed still clung to its bottom, along with something else that made Miss Marple's blood run cold, Mixed with the seeds were tiny fragments of what appeared to be meat or fish, coated with a fine white powder. "Tom, I want you to fetch Inspector Slack immediately. Tell him that Miss Marple has discovered evidence related to Mr. Weatherby's death, and that he should bring Dr. Haydock if possible." She wrapped the bowl carefully in her handkerchief. "And Tom, don't mention what you found to anyone. Else, this information could be extremely dangerous in the wrong hands." As the young man hurried away through the woods, Miss Marple remained in the clearing, contemplating the sinister picture that was emerging from the evidence. Gerald Pembroke had not only trained a robin to respond to his whistle signals, but had been conditioning the bird with poisoned food. The midnight song had been a death trap, luring Alfred Weatherby to a specific location where the trained robin would deliver its lethal payload. But as she stood in the quiet clearing, listening to the natural sounds of the forest, Miss Marple realized that she was still missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. If Pembroke had gone to such elaborate lengths to kill Weatherby using the trained robin, why had he then destroyed the birdcage and apparently killed the bird itself? The answer came to her with sudden, chilling clarity. The bird had been destroyed not because it was evidence of the murder method, but because it was evidence of who had trained it. Someone else in the village possessed the skills and knowledge necessary to create such an elaborate death trap, and Gerald Pembroke was not the killer. He was the next intended victim. Chapter 7. The hunter becomes the hunted. Inspector Slack arrived at Hangman's Wood within the hour, accompanied by Dr. Haydock and Constable Lake. Miss Marple had remained in the clearing, carefully preserving the scene, while her mind worked through the implications of her discovery. The inspector's expression grew increasingly grim as she explained what Tom Price had witnessed and showed him the evidence she had uncovered. "So, you're suggesting that Pembroke didn't kill Weatherby, but was instead training a bird to protect himself from some other threat?" Inspector Slack examined the poisoned bowl with professional skepticism. "That seems rather far-fetched, Miss Marple." Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had been testing the white powder residue with a small chemical kit he carried for field investigations. "Actually, Inspector, Miss Marple's theory has merit. This powder appears to be strychnine, a very different poison from the nicotine that killed Weatherby. Someone has been experimenting with multiple toxic substances." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "I believe Mr. Pembroke discovered that he was being stalked by someone from his wartime unit, someone who knew about the Saint Marcel incident and was systematically eliminating witnesses. He was attempting to train a robin to serve as an early warning system, using the same signals that were once used by Operation Robin." Inspector Slack made careful notes. "But if Pembroke is innocent of Weatherby's murder, then who killed the man? And why?" "I believe the real killer is someone who has been hiding in plain sight, Inspector. Someone with extensive knowledge of wartime espionage techniques, access to various poisons, and a deep understanding of the psychological profiles of their intended victims." Miss Marple paused, choosing her words carefully. "Someone who has been systematically hunting down members of Operation Robin, eliminating them one by one." As if summoned by her words, the sound of footsteps approaching through the woods made them all turn toward the path. Gerald Pembroke emerged from the trees, his face haggard and his clothing dishevelled. In his hands he carried a military-style rucksack and what appeared to be camping equipment. "Inspector Slack," he called out, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Thank God you're here. I've been trying to reach you since dawn." Inspector Slack stepped forward cautiously. "Mr. Pembroke, I need to ask you about your activities in these woods this morning." Pembroke's laugh was bitter and edged with hysteria. "My activities? I've been running for my life, Inspector. Someone has been hunting me like an animal, and they nearly succeeded last night." Miss Marple studied Pembroke's appearance more closely. His clothes bore tears consistent with rapid movement through dense undergrowth, and there were scratches on his hands and face from thorns and branches. Most tellingly, his eyes held the wide, alert expression of a man in genuine fear. "Who has been hunting you, Mr. Pembroke?" she asked gently. "I wish I knew. Someone who knows everything about Operation Robin. Someone who understands our old signals and methods better than we do ourselves." Pembroke set down his rucksack with trembling hands. "They've been leaving messages for me, Miss Marple. Coded messages using our wartime protocols, telling me exactly when and how they plan to kill me." Inspector Slack exchanged glances with Miss Marple. What sort of messages? Pembroke reached into his jacket and produced several pieces of paper, each bearing text written in the same coded format they had seen in Mrs. Cartwright's library. They started appearing 3 days ago, slipped under my door at night, each one more specific than the last about the method and timing of my death. Dr. Haydock examined the messages with professional interest. These codes are quite sophisticated. Whoever wrote them has extensive knowledge of wartime cryptography. That's what terrifies me, Pembroke admitted. There were only 12 men in Operation Robin, and most of them are dead. Alfred was the 8th to die in recent years, leaving only myself, Colonel Melchett, and 2 others still alive. Someone is systematically eliminating us. Miss Marple felt a chill of realization. Mr. Pembroke, you said Alfred was the 8th to die. Were the others also victims of apparent accidents or natural causes? Every single one. Heart attacks, accidents, sudden illnesses. Nothing that would arouse suspicion if viewed individually. But taken together, the pattern is unmistakable. Pembroke's voice dropped to a whisper. Someone has been hunting us for years, and they're very, very good at what they do. The implications of this revelation transformed their entire understanding of the case. They were not dealing with a single murder motivated by wartime secrets, but with a systematic campaign of assassination that had been ongoing for years. Alfred Weatherby's death had been just the latest in a series of carefully orchestrated killings. Who else knew the details of what happened at Saint-Marcel? Miss Marple asked. Pembroke's face went white. That's the thing, Miss Marple. The only people who knew the full truth were the members of Operation Robin itself, which means, he swallowed hard, which means the killer is one of us. One of the 4 survivors has been systematically murdering the others. Inspector Slack began issuing orders to Constable Lake. I want Colonel Melchett brought in for questioning immediately, and find out the identities and current whereabouts of the other 2 surviving members of Operation Robin. But Miss Marple was studying the coded messages more closely, her experienced eye noting details that others might miss. The handwriting was disguised, but there were certain characteristic formations that seemed familiar. More significantly, the paper itself bore a subtle watermark that she had seen before in recent days. Inspector, she said quietly, I believe we should examine these messages more carefully. The killer has made their first mistake, and it may be enough to identify them. As they prepared to leave Hangman's Wood, Miss Marple reflected on the complexity of the case that was unfolding. They were dealing with a predator who had spent years perfecting the art of murder, someone who understood their victims intimately enough to exploit their deepest fears and oldest memories. The Midnight Robin's song had been just one weapon in an arsenal of psychological and physical tools designed to kill without detection, but every hunter, no matter how skilled, eventually made a mistake, and Miss Marple was beginning to see the pattern that would lead them to the truth. Chapter 8. The Librarian's Secret Arsenal. The afternoon sun was slanting through the windows of the village library when Inspector Slack, accompanied by Miss Marple and Dr. Haydock, arrived to conduct a more thorough examination of the break-in that Mrs. Cartwright had reported. The librarian met them at the door, her usual composed demeanour intact, despite the morning's revelations about Gerald Pembroke and the systematic murders of Operation Robin members. I've prepared all the remaining materials for your inspection, Mrs. Cartwright announced, leading them toward her private office behind the main reading room. Though, I must confess, I've been thinking about the break-in all morning, and I may have been too hasty in my initial assessment. Miss Marple paused in her examination of the disturbed filing cabinets. Too hasty in what way, Mrs. Cartwright? The librarian hesitated, her fingers worrying at the chain of her reading glasses. When I discovered the intrusion yesterday morning, I assumed the burglar had taken what they came for. But, after reflection, I wonder if they might have been unsuccessful in their search. Inspector Slack looked up from the scattered documents he was sorting. What makes you think that? The pattern of the search, Inspector. Initially it appeared to be the work of someone who knew exactly what they wanted and where to find it. But when I examined the damage more closely, I realized the intruder had become increasingly frantic as their search progressed. Mrs. Cartwright gestured toward her desk, where drawers had been pulled out completely and their contents dumped on the floor. This level of destruction suggests desperation, not success. Miss Marple found herself studying Mrs. Cartwright's office with new eyes, noting details that had escaped her attention during their previous visit. The room was larger than it had first appeared, with several alcoves and storage areas that would not be immediately visible to a casual intruder. More significantly, she observed that while the obvious storage spaces had been thoroughly ransacked, certain less accessible areas appeared untouched. "Mrs. Cartwright, where exactly did you keep the photographs that were stolen?" "In the main filing cabinet, under W for wartime materials. It's the most logical place for anyone familiar with library organization systems to look." But Miss Marple was examining a small locked cabinet in one of the office alcoves, noting that its brass fittings showed no signs of tampering. "What do you keep in this cabinet, Mrs. Cartwright?" The librarian's composure faltered for the first time since their arrival. "Personal materials, family documents and the like, nothing that would be of interest to anyone else." Dr. Haydock, who had been quietly examining the coded message they had found earlier, suddenly looked up with an expression of startled recognition. "Mrs. Cartwright, this watermark on the paper, it's rather distinctive. Might I ask where you purchase your personal stationery?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Miss Marple watched with growing certainty as the librarian's carefully maintained facade began to crack. I use standard library supplies for most correspondence." But Inspector Slack had noticed the same watermark that had caught Dr. Haydock's attention. "This paper matches the coded messages that were sent to Gerald Pembroke, Mrs. Cartwright. I think you need to explain exactly what's in that locked cabinet." The transformation in Mrs. Cartwright was dramatic and complete. The mild-mannered librarian vanished, replaced by someone whose eyes held the cold calculation of a professional killer. When she spoke again, her voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to commanding life-and-death decisions. "You're all very clever, but not quite clever enough." She moved slowly toward the locked cabinet, her movements precise and economical. "I suppose it was inevitable that someone would eventually notice the pattern, though I had hoped to complete my work before discovery became necessary." Miss Marple watched with fascination as Mrs. Cartwright produced a small key and opened the cabinet, revealing an interior entirely different from what one might expect to find in a village library. Instead of family documents, the shelves held an array of materials that spoke of very different skills: chemical apparatus, reference books on toxicology, and what appeared to be a comprehensive collection of military intelligence manuals. "You were a member of Operation Robin," Miss Marple said, with quiet certainty. "Not one of the 12 men in the official unit, but someone connected to the operation in a different capacity." Mrs. Cartwright smiled, and the expression transformed her face entirely. "Very perceptive, Miss Marple. I was indeed part of Operation Robin, though not in the way you might think. I was Agent Nightingale, the radio operator who coordinated communications between the field team and London headquarters." Inspector Slack had his hand on his truncheon, but Mrs. Cartwright made no threatening moves. Instead, she continued her explanation with the calm satisfaction of someone finally able to reveal a secret she had carried for 30 years. "I was barely 18 when they recruited me, fresh out of signal school and eager to serve my country. They told me I would be supporting heroic men engaged in vital resistance work behind enemy lines." Her voice hardened. "What they didn't tell me was that I would be providing communication support for mass murderers." The revelation of Mrs. Cartwright's true identity explained many of the puzzling aspects of the case. As the radio operator for Operation Robin, she would have had detailed knowledge of all the unit's activities, including the Saint-Marcel incident that had haunted the survivors for decades. "You knew about the church bombing from the beginning," Dr. Haydock observed. "I knew about it before it happened. Gerald Pembroke, as he calls himself now, sent coded messages requesting authorization for what he termed enhanced interrogations of suspected collaborators. When London denied permission, he proceeded anyway." Mrs. Cartwright's composure cracked slightly. 17 innocent people died in that church, Doctor. 17 souls whose deaths I could have prevented if I had broken protocol and warned the local authorities. Miss Marple began to understand the psychological complexity of the murders they were investigating. "You've been killing the members of Operation Robin, not just to prevent exposure of the Saint-Marcel incident, but as punishment for what you consider war crimes. Justice, Miss Marple. I've been delivering justice that was denied by official channels for 30 years. Mrs. Cartwright reached into the cabinet again, this time withdrawing what appeared to be a leather-bound journal. I documented everything, every operation, every casualty, every civilian death that resulted from their activities. The men of Operation Robin were not heroes. They were criminals who used the war as cover for their brutality. The journal's pages revealed meticulous records of the unit's activities, written in the same precise hand that had created the coded messages sent to Gerald Pembroke. More disturbing were the detailed accounts of how each former Operation Robin member had been killed, complete with chemical formulas, timing calculations, and psychological profiles of the victims. "The Midnight Robin Song," Inspector Slack said slowly. "That was your signal to Alfred Weatherby." Mrs. Cartwright nodded with obvious pride. Alfred always was the most conscientious member of the unit. He would respond to an emergency signal without question, even after all these years. I simply used his training and his conscience against him. Miss Marple found herself studying the woman with a mixture of revulsion and clinical fascination. "But you made a mistake, Mrs. Cartwright. You assumed that Gerald Pembroke was guilty of the same crimes as the others, when in fact he was trying to protect himself from your campaign of murder." For the first time, Mrs. Cartwright showed genuine surprise. Gerald was the worst of them all. The Saint Marcel bombing was his idea, his plan, his execution. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied gently. "But he was also the one who recognized that someone was systematically killing Operation Robin veterans. His attempts to train the Robin were not preparation for another murder, but an effort to create an early warning system against your next attack." The irony was not lost on any of them. The man whom Mrs. Cartwright had marked for death had been the only one smart enough to recognize the pattern of her murders and take steps to protect himself. Chapter 9. The Radio Operator's Last Transmission. The arrest of Mrs. Cartwright proceeded with the strange formality that attended the capture of someone who had clearly been expecting this moment for some time. She offered no resistance as Inspector Slack placed her in custody, and even assisted in cataloguing the extensive evidence contained within her locked cabinet. Her demeanour had shifted once again, this time to that of a professional completing a final necessary task. "You'll find detailed documentation of all my activities over the past 8 years, she informed Inspector Slack, as he carefully removed chemical apparatus and reference materials from the cabinet. "I've maintained complete records, including the methods used for each elimination and the justification for targeting each individual." Dr. Haydock examined several small vials containing what appeared to be various toxic substances. "This is quite an extensive collection of poisons, Mrs. Cartwright. Where did you acquire such materials?" Chemistry was always a hobby of mine, even before the war. During my time as a radio operator, I had access to various materials used for emergency situations, cyanide tablets for agents facing capture, that sort of thing. After the war, I simply expanded my knowledge through academic study. She gestured toward a shelf lined with university textbooks on biochemistry and toxicology. Amazing what one can learn through correspondence courses and careful experimentation. Miss Marple found herself examining the journal that documented Mrs. Cartwright's campaign of murder with horrified fascination. The entries were written in the precise, organized style of someone who had approached killing with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to her library work. "According to this," she observed, "you began eliminating Operation Robin members in 1975, nearly 30 years after the war ended. What triggered your decision to begin this campaign?" Mrs. Cartwright's expression grew distant, as though she were viewing events from long ago through a window of memory. "I received a letter from Father Bernard's niece. She had been researching her family's history and had discovered evidence that her uncle was not the collaborator that official reports claimed. In fact, he had been secretly sheltering Jewish refugees in his church and had never provided information to the Germans. The revelation struck Miss Marple with the force of absolute certainty. The Saint Marcel bombing had not eliminated a traitor, but had murdered an innocent priest and 16 other civilians who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. You realized that the Operation Robin members were not heroes, but war criminals who had escaped punishment. More than that, Miss Marple, I realized that I had been complicit in their crimes. Every coded message I transmitted, every communication I facilitated, had contributed to the deaths of innocent people. Mrs. Cartwright's voice carried the weight of decades of guilt. I had two choices: live with the knowledge of what we had done, or ensure that justice was finally served. Inspector Slack paused in his cataloguing of evidence. So you decided to become judge, jury, and executioner for men who had committed crimes 30 years ago? I decided to complete a mission that should have been finished at the end of the war. The men of Operation Robin were never held accountable for their actions, because the chaos of the immediate post-war period allowed them to disappear into civilian life with clean records and honoured reputations. Miss Marple studied the journal entries more closely, noting the meticulous planning that had gone into each murder. You spent years learning about each man's civilian life, their habits, their weaknesses, their fears. The poisoning of Alfred Weatherby was not an isolated crime, but part of a systematic campaign that required extensive preparation. Mrs. Cartwright nodded with obvious pride. Each elimination was tailored to the individual psychology of the target. Alfred responded to authority and duty, hence the emergency signal he could not ignore. Others had different vulnerabilities that could be exploited. Dr. Haydock had been examining the chemical formulas recorded in the journal, his expression growing increasingly grave. Some of these substances are extremely sophisticated. Creating concentrated nicotine extract from tobacco plants requires considerable knowledge of organic chemistry. I had 8 years to perfect my methods, Doctor. 8 years to study, experiment, and prepare for each specific target. Mrs. Cartwright's voice carried a chilling matter-of-factness. I treated each murder as a research project, gathering information about the victim's daily routines, health conditions, and psychological profile. Miss Marple closed the journal, unable to continue reading the detailed accounts of calculated murder. What I find most disturbing, Mrs. Cartwright, is not the extent of your crimes, but the meticulous way you documented them. This journal reads like a scientific study rather than a confession of multiple murders. Because that's exactly what it is, Miss Marple, a study in applied justice, with careful notation of methods and results. Mrs. Cartwright straightened in her chair, her professional pride evident even in custody. I approached the elimination of war criminals with the same systematic methodology I brought to cataloguing library materials. Inspector Slack had finished securing the evidence and was preparing to transport his prisoner to the county police station. Mrs. Cartwright, is there anything else we should know about your activities? Any other crimes or intended victims? The librarian consulted her journal one final time. With Alfred's death, only 3 Operation Robin veterans remained alive: Gerald Pembroke, Colonel Melchett, and a man named Harrison, who emigrated to Canada in 1947. My work was nearly complete. Miss Marple realized, with cold certainty, that they had interrupted Mrs. Cartwright's campaign only days, or perhaps hours, before she would have moved against her next target. You were planning to kill Colonel Melchett next. Tomorrow evening, actually. I prepared a rather elegant method involving his evening constitutional and a trained robin that would deliver a concentrated dose of strychnine. Mrs. Cartwright's smile held genuine regret. I suppose that plan will have to remain theoretical now. As Inspector Slack led Mrs. Cartwright from the library, Miss Marple remained behind to contemplate the scene of one of the most complex and disturbing crimes she had ever encountered. The mild-mannered librarian had hidden a secret arsenal of death for 8 years, using her position of trust and respectability to hunt down men whose wartime crimes had gone unpunished by official channels. The Midnight Robin song had been both the culmination of her campaign and the beginning of its unravelling. In her meticulous planning and documentation, Mrs. Cartwright had created the very evidence that would ensure her conviction for multiple murders. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, had indeed been served, but not in the way that any of them had expected. Chapter 10. Dawn, Chorus, and Justice Served. 3 weeks after Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright's arrest, Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the genuine dawn chorus of autumn birds, preparing for their winter migration. The events surrounding Alfred Weatherby's death had cast a shadow over St. Mary Mead that was only now beginning to lift, as the village slowly came to terms with the revelation that their trusted librarian had been one of the most methodical serial killers in English criminal history. The Morning Post brought a letter from Inspector Slack, providing her with the final details of the case that the courts would soon address. Mrs. Cartwright had confessed to 8 murders spanning nearly a decade, each one carefully planned and executed using her extensive knowledge of chemistry and psychology. The journal found in her office had provided investigators with detailed documentation of crimes that might otherwise have remained unsolved mysteries. Miss Marple was interrupted in her reading by the arrival of Gerald Pembroke, who appeared at her garden gate looking considerably healthier than when she had last seen him in Hangman's Wood. The haunted expression had left his eyes, replaced by something that might eventually become peace. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding, but I wanted to thank you before I leave St. Mary Mead." She invited him into her sitting room, noting that he carried a small travelling case and appeared dressed for departure. "You're leaving us, Mr. Pembroke?" "I think it's time. Too many memories, too many secrets that are better left buried." He settled himself in the chair she offered, his manner more relaxed than she had ever seen it. "I've decided to return to Australia, where I lived for several years after the war. There's a small town in Queensland where no one knows about Operation Robin, or what we did during those dark months in France." Miss Marple prepared tea while considering the complex moral questions that Mrs. Cartwright's crimes had raised. The librarian had been motivated by a genuine desire for justice, but had chosen methods that made her as culpable as those she hunted. "Have you been able to come to terms with what happened at St. Marcel?" she asked gently. Pembroke's expression grew distant. "I'll never be able to justify what I did in that church, Miss Marple. 17 innocent people died because I was convinced that taking decisive action was more important than waiting for proper authorization." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I've learned something important from this whole terrible business." "What's that, Mr. Pembroke?" "That living with guilt is not the same as accepting responsibility. For 30 years I tried to hide from what I had done, changing my name, moving to different countries, building a new identity. But the guilt followed me everywhere." He met her eyes directly. Mrs. Cartwright was wrong to take justice into her own hands, but she was right about one thing. What we did in France was a war crime, and we should have faced proper consequences. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "What do you plan to do with that knowledge?" "I've been in contact with authorities in France who are investigating wartime incidents. When I reach Australia, I intend to provide them with a full account of the St. Marcel bombing and my role in planning it." Pembroke's voice carried a quiet determination. "It may result in extradition and prosecution, but that's a risk I'm finally ready to accept." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Colonel Melchett, who appeared at the door looking considerably older than his years. The revelation that he had been Mrs. Cartwright's intended next victim had shaken him profoundly, forcing him to confront his own mortality and the weight of secrets he had carried for decades. "Gerald," he said with obvious relief, "I hoped I might catch you before you departed." Miss Marple excused herself to prepare additional tea, allowing the 2 former comrades to speak privately about matters that had haunted them both for 30 years. When she returned, she found them sitting in the comfortable silence of men who had finally unburdened themselves of long-carried guilt. "Colonel Melchett has decided to accompany me to Australia," Pembroke explained. "We thought it would be easier to face whatever comes next if we faced it together." Miss Marple nodded approvingly. In her experience, the most difficult journeys were often made more bearable by the presence of those who understood the terrain. As the 2 men prepared to leave, Colonel Melchett turned back to address her one final time. "Miss Marple, I want you to know that discovering Mrs. Cartwright's identity may have saved my life, but it also gave me something more valuable, the courage to finally do what I should have done 30 years ago." After their departure, Miss Marple remained in her sitting room, contemplating the complex web of justice and revenge that had nearly destroyed several lives in their quiet village. Mrs. Cartwright's methodical campaign of murder had been motivated by a genuine desire to see justice done, but had resulted in her becoming the very thing she claimed to be fighting against. The Midnight Robin song that had lured Alfred Weatherby to his death would forever serve as a reminder that the most dangerous secrets were often those that seemed safely buried in the past. War, Miss Marple reflected, never truly ended for those who had witnessed its worst extremes. It simply transformed, taking on new shapes and finding new victims in each succeeding generation. The sound of genuine birdsong from her garden drew her to the window, where she observed a small robin perched on her fence post, singing its natural dawn greeting to the world. This bird sang not in response to human signals or trained commands, but from the simple joy of being alive in the morning sunlight. That evening, as Miss Marple recorded her thoughts about the case in her private journal, she wrote, "The most elaborate deceptions often collapse under the weight of their own complexity. Mrs. Cartwright's campaign of revenge required such meticulous planning and documentation that it ultimately provided the evidence for her own conviction. In attempting to serve justice, she became the very criminal she sought to punish." She paused in her writing, listening to the peaceful sounds of St. Mary Mead settling into evening quiet. Somewhere in the distance she could hear the natural chorus of birds preparing for nightfall, robins and thrushes, blackbirds and wrens, each singing their own authentic songs without need for human training or manipulation. The midnight robin who had sung Alfred Weatherby to his death was silent now, its artificial voice stilled forever. But the genuine birds of St. Mary Mead continued their eternal music, a reminder that truth, like dawn, always returns to dispel the darkness of human deception. Justice, Miss Marple concluded, was a word that meant different things to different people. Mrs. Cartwright had believed she was serving justice by eliminating war criminals who had escaped official punishment. Gerald Pembroke and Colonel Melchett had finally chosen to serve justice by accepting responsibility for their wartime actions, and the legal system would serve justice by ensuring that Mrs. Cartwright faced consequences for her methodical campaign of murder. But perhaps the truest justice was simply the restoration of honesty to a community that had been living with hidden secrets and unacknowledged guilt for far too long. The midnight robin's artificial song had been silenced, but the genuine voices of St. Mary Mead could finally speak their truth without fear of what the darkness might reveal. Miss Marple closed her journal and prepared for bed, listening one last time to the natural evening chorus outside her window. Tomorrow would bring new puzzles and new mysteries, as it always did in a village where human nature displayed its full complexity. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, St. Mary Mead would sleep peacefully, secure in the knowledge that its secrets had finally been brought into the light. The robin who had sung at midnight would sing no more, but the dawn chorus would continue as it always had, marking the eternal cycle of darkness and light, secrets and truth, justice delayed and justice finally served. And there, dear listeners of Velvet Clues, ends our tale of the midnight robin and the deadly secrets it helped to reveal. Miss Marple has once again shown us that the most innocent-seeming events can hide the darkest of truths, and that justice, though sometimes delayed, has a way of finding its voice in the most unexpected places. Until next time, this has been Connor, reminding you that in the quiet corners of our world, mysteries await those with eyes to see and the courage to seek the truth.